Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I hope you're well. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. It's time to get back into the Olivet Discourse. We have been investigating the relationship between Matthew 25:31 and following, pardon me, and really an awful lot of the rest of Scripture. Here is Jesus coming as the Son of Man to sit on the throne of his glory, all the nations gathered before him, and he receives the kingdom. That is, sits on the throne of his glory. Pardon me. We could technically say, more accurately say, that this is Christ not receiving initially his kingdom, as some try to argue, but rather having received the kingdom, when he ascended to the Father. Luke chapter 19:11. A certain nobleman went into a far country there to receive the kingdom. Matthew chapter 25:31 is posited after Christ had gone to the Father, had received the kingdom. He would then return in the kingdom to judge and to rule. So Matthew chapter 25 is not is not the initiation of Christ receiving the kingdom, as if he had not received the kingdom prior. Remember, he went into a far country to receive the kingdom. Matthew 25 is the return after having received the kingdom. This is a critical distinction. So, Matthew chapter 25 is Christ coming in vindication of his own suffering, coming in vindication of his followers, and they receive the kingdom. Well, we've been looking at Revelation chapter 11, trying to set the proper context, because in Revelation chapter 11, 15 and following, at the destruction of the city, quote, where the Lord was slain, the paean of victory is sung, which says, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Christ, of our God, and of his Christ, So we have parallel passages here. And I've spent a little bit of time examining the two witnesses. No, I haven't tried to identify them. I don't want to get sidetracked into that discussion, even though it's interesting. Many of you have made suggestions that are, worthwhile to investigate, and I do appreciate that. The point that I've been focused on is the more generic, the more broad-based concept of these two witnesses, the sphere of their work, the realm of their work, the location of their work, to help us set the context for the reception of the kingdom. Now, we've had a good bit to say about the two witnesses, and I want you to notice this morning, these two witnesses are two prophets of God. And they testify. But they are slain, finally, after they have finished their ministry. Now, of course, it's interesting, not to get sidetracked, but it's interesting that Paul, after he finished his ministry, was slain. So, in Revelation chapter 11, we have two prophets, two witnesses, and they are slain, and their dead bodies lie in the street of the city where the Lord was crucified. Now, you need to know that many commentators, men such as Moses Stewart, they came to Revelation chapter 11, and even though in chapter 12 and following of Revelation, they said, oh, well, this is talking about Rome, this was written later, they were forced by the evidence to admit Revelation chapter 11, 6 and following, is talking about Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And that is not an unknown or an uncommon view among commentators. But here's what I want to focus on in the rest of my time this morning. This city, spiritually designated as Sodom and Egypt, it is also where the Lord was crucified. It is the city guilty of killing the prophets. If there's any one element of Scripture that really ought to cue us in as to the identity of this city, this alone, ladies and gentlemen, should do it. What city in all of the Bible is ever, always, constantly identified as the city that killed the prophets? In Matthew chapter 23, 29 and following, Jesus, standing in the temple, castigated the Jews. And he said, "You bear witness to yourselves that you are the sons of those who killed the prophets. Because you say, well, if we would have been alive in the days of the prophets, we would not have slain days of our fathers. We would not have slain the prophets. You thereby bear witness to yourselves that you are the sons of those who killed the prophets." Folks, he's not talking about New York City. He's not talking about Babylon in Iraq. He is not talking about anywhere in America. He is talking about one city and one city only. So he continues. And he challenged Israel about what they were going to do in that first century generation. "Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Behold, I send to you wise men, scribes, and prophets." Parallel passage, Luke chapter 11. "Some of them you will scourge, some of them you will crucify, that upon you may come all of the righteous blood shed on the earth, from righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar." Folks, who did Jesus identify as the city that was going to fill up the measure of their sin by killing the prophets in the first century? And so when people go to the book of Revelation, this is just, it's ludicrously sad. I can't think of a better term at the moment. It is literally ludicrously bad when we are told, well, Babylon of Revelation, that great city, no, that cannot be Jerusalem. It's a composite city, we are told. It's made up of ancient Babylon. It's made up of Rome. It's made up a little bit of Jerusalem. Ladies and gentlemen, ancient Babylon never killed a prophet of God. I was on a radio talk show some years ago out of Florida. We were talking about things like this, and a guy calls in, and he says, "With all due respect, Mr. Preston, you're just all wet. Babylon in Iraq is the Babylon of Revelation." So I called attention to Revelation chapter 11. I called attention to Revelation chapter 16. And I said, so with these passages in mind, would you name for me one single, especially Old Testament prophet that was killed by literal Babylon in Iraq? And he goes, "Well, sure, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." I said, "Well, sir, with all due respect here, they were cast into the fire that was 7 times hotter than normal. They didn't even get a sunburn." And he literally goes on the air, "Oh, that's right." And I said, "You don't want to use Daniel, right?" He said, "Well, no." I said, "Okay. Those are the only prophets that we're told about in Babylon, literal Babylon." And he was courageous enough to say, "Well, I never thought about that. Thank you very much." And he hung up. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the point. these are God's prophets in Revelation chapter 11. Pardon me. They are slain in the city where the Lord was crucified. We don't have any problem identifying who that is, do we? We're not going to make the preposterous argument, as one individual did on Facebook recently, saying, oh, Preston, you're just all wrong. Jesus wasn't crucified in Jerusalem. I never said he was. I said he was crucified at, or it is where he was crucified. Huge difference. But this individual was simply grasping at straws. So, what do we have? In Luke 13, 28 to 33, Jesus reiterated what he said in Matthew chapter 23, that it was Jerusalem that killed the prophets. In Luke chapter 11, 49, Jesus was warned not to go to Jerusalem because Herod the fox seeks your life. And Jesus said, well, you go tell Herod that fox that today I travel, and tomorrow and the third day I will be perfected, and it's not possible that a prophet perish out of Jerusalem. And I've had people argue with me, hey, all I have to do is to prove that one prophet, one single prophet perished outside of Jerusalem. That's not the point, ladies and gentlemen. The point is that Jerusalem was the source of killing the prophets. You know, kind of like Paul, before he was Paul, had letters of authority from the high priest at Jerusalem to travel all the way to Damascus, for crying out loud, to persecute and to kill Christians. What was the source of that persecution? It wasn't Damascus, it was Jerusalem. Furthermore, and finally this morning, so much more I could add. Stephen, standing in the temple in Acts chapter 7, gives one of the greatest lessons in all of history to that recalcitrant, rebellious, murderous crowd, and reminds them they have slain Jesus. And he says, which of the prophets have your fathers not slain? Ladies and gentlemen, my challenge to you is, if you're going to identify Babylon of Revelation as any city other than Old Covenant Jerusalem, who is guilty of shedding all of the blood of all of the righteous shed on the earth, who is guilty of the blood of the apostles and the prophets of Jesus, Revelation 18, 20 and 24. If you're going to identify Babylon as any other city that had a long, bloody history of killing the prophets, Revelation 16:6. If you're going to identify any city other than Jerusalem as that city, then the burden of proof lies squarely on you. Show us. I challenge anyone. Show us where the Bible points the finger at any city other than Jerusalem as being guilty of shedding the blood of the prophets. You know, I've been making that challenge for years. And I have been told, well, you just don't understand, Preston. It's true that that's what Jesus said. It's true that even Paul said that. But John is written at a different time under different circumstances. That's a false claim. I'm out of time. Thank you for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. I will see you on the flip side.